the people that were in charge had a fear that was based on perception rather than reality, but they were the ones in charge, and as we know, those that are in charge get to write history.
Welcome to Grassroots, a podcast about golf and culture. We're filming today and coming to you from the California African American Museum. My name is Versalles, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host John Nichols. And we have a very special guest, Mr. Bill Spiller Jr. We're here today as it is PGA Week to honor the legacy and life of Bill Spiller Sr. Bill Spiller Sr. is largely credited with being the person that takes on the PGA of America and puts an end to the Caucasian-only clause. He is a native of the town of Tishomingo, Oklahoma, and came to Los Angeles, and as a result of that, we have some artifacts here. We have a foot locker and a golf bag that the Spiller family had donated to the museum. It was part of an exhibition that was titled The African American Journey West. Mr. Spiller, we're so grateful to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you.
As John and I like to talk, when we talk about the Grassroots podcast, we say to people it is 90% life, 10%
golf. Yeah, that's what we're just like mimicking the experience you have on the golf course, where you don't talk about golf a whole bunch. You talk about people's life, you learn about them, and you talk about golf a little bit, but that's what we're trying to mimic.
Yeah, but today we're going to talk 100%.
Oh, for sure, man.
100.
We got a real one.
About the life of your father, Bill Spiller Sr., someone who changed the landscape of golf with his courage and with his willingness to take on the PGA of America. So, coming from the small town of Tishomingo, Oklahoma, where your father was born, he then moves to Tulsa at a young age, right around 9, and this is shortly after the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. I wonder if there were any stories of your father's childhood, of growing up in Tulsa that he would have shared with you.
There were a few, but none that had any specific information other than what he told us in general terms. And then from his generation, that generation of what I would term disenfranchised Americans, all felt that the number one item on your agenda growing up was to get an education. That was drilled into me from as far back as I can remember. And it's actually why he left Oklahoma, and then after graduating from college, why he left Texas. But all that he tells me that I can remember about his early upbringing really was not about the race riots. He never mentioned that. I learned that on my own, but he did talk about the cotton fields quite a bit, and apparently my family's history involved him as a kid picking cotton. His dad, Bud, picked cotton, and there may have been some ties back to slavery with that, but other than that, he really didn't talk about his upbringing much at all.
Was his father a sharecropper, or?
I can't say what my grandfather did on my dad's side. My memories of him go back to the 1950s when we used to travel every summer to visit him in Tucson, Arizona, which is where he moved to. But my earliest recollections of my grandfather were that he was a restaurateur. Now, we're not talking about a 5-star restaurant these days, but in those days, everything was a neighborhood joint. And he owned a restaurant called Bud's Place.
I like some of that.
I'd pull up to Bud's Place. That sounds fun, yeah.
Yeah, pretty good food.
So your father graduated from Booker T. Washington High School in Tulsa. He went to Wiley College and HBCU in Louisiana. You talked about education a little bit. How important was it to him and your family in general?
For my dad's generation and everyone in his generation, what they were looking for was opportunity. Education was very important to him for two reasons. One, little known fact about him is that he was an AAU championship basketball player. So he was a basketball player in college. He was not a golfer, but he played what today would have been a point guard. Back then in women's basketball, women could not dribble a ball across half court. Only two women could go across half court.
Sure.
This was in the rule book?
I don't know if it was in the rule book, but it's certainly part of women's basketball history. But he played competitively with all of the what are now called HBCUs, Prairie View, Texas Southern, places like that.
Sure.
But he was an all-star basketball player in AAU terms. What strikes me about that period of time is I think their uniforms were made out of wool.
Imagine that.
In those hot gyms.
Ooh.
Wool and silk.
In the South.
Ooh.
Yeah, the numbers were silk, and but the basic material I think was wool.
I'm almost itching thinking
sweating
of
right
that.
now.
That is unbelievable. Unbelievable. So Wiley, although really close to Shreveport, but technically in Texas, Wiley College. And the reason I bring that up is John and I have been, kind of digging into, for me it started with Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns. And we've really dug into kind of, when people say to you, like, where are your people from? They mean, like, are your people from the Carolinas? Are they from Mississippi? Are they from Louisiana? And we find that so many people in Los Angeles have direct ties to the Great Migration of people that leave largely kind of, let's call it, East Texas and Louisiana, and some 700,000 people from that part of the United States come to Los Angeles kind of mid-century. What was it that brought your father to Los Angeles?
My father came to Los Angeles because of opportunity. At the time, we're talking right after World War II. And so the aerospace industry was just getting on its feet. The airplane industry was already established. In fact, my uncle worked for Douglas Aircraft, which is in El Segundo. There's no longer a Douglas Aircraft, but...
Is that associated with McDonnell Douglas?
It became McDonnell Douglas.
Okay, yeah.
It was a merger of McDonnell and Douglas, and I think they're now headquartered in St. Louis, if I'm not mistaken. But having said that, my uncle had achieved a measure of status because he was an engineer working for Douglas Aircraft at the time. So since he also was from Oklahoma originally, my mom and dad followed them to California because of the opportunity. California was wide open. It still is. We, Californians, if you look at the makeup ethnically of most places in the United States, with few exceptions, neighborhoods are still segregated primarily. So you have the black neighborhood in this city, and you have the Latino neighborhood. You have the Italian neighborhood, and the further east you go, the more you find that to this day. But California really never had that. At least Los Angeles didn't. So they moved to what, if you're from Los Angeles, you know as the East Side, which is different from East LA. And that south along Central Avenue from Washington Boulevard, that was the great African-American diaspora. And the city just grew from that point. So that's where they lived at first, on 41st Street. But then they were able to buy a place in Los Angeles County, which is south of LA City proper. But it was the opportunity. He started working as a red cap. Red cap is what today is called a sky cap. But they all worked at the train stations, and they all wore red caps, which is where the name comes from. It provided him a measure of income while he pursued his golf career.
And daily pay. I mean, that's a tip job. So you're coming home every day with some cash in hand.
With cash.
Yeah.
Not much, but with cash.
Golf is a hard sport. I just picked it up a year and a half ago. It's the hardest sport I've ever played in my life. Your dad picked it up at 29 on a dare. You know, and they said he was a natural. There's no naturals in this sport. You have to work, you know? And I mean, can you speak to his work ethic a little bit?
My dad was a person that believed in fundamentals, but also one who paid a great deal of attention to the details in terms of the mechanics of his swing and his ability to play. He was not what we call a long knocker. He didn't hit the ball that far compared to other pros of the day. In fact, I think I started out hitting him when I was 12, but I was 6 feet tall. So I think arc had a lot to do with that if you want to talk about mechanics, but he played every day, and he would have played 24 hours a day if he could have. So his attention to detail was pretty impressive. It's all he knew that he wanted to do. He had a college degree but couldn't use it other than as a teacher, and he didn't want to do that, so he focused on his golf. He turned pro within 4 years of picking up the game.
Amazing.
And just as a comment, it's not that it's the hardest game in the world, but it is the only game that I'm aware of where the people that do it for a living can't get it right.
That's a good way of putting it.
Give us an idea of your dad's frame. 5'10", 5'8"?
He was about 5'9", and on a good day in the 50s, he could hit a drive maybe 220, 230.
How far were they hitting it back then? Like, what was it what the game look like at that point? Like,
Everyone was hitting it about that far.
Okay.
Yeah,
So he was on par with most
Yeah,
players.
the equipment was not designed for the distances that they have today, or the athleticism that's involved today, because back then no one went to the gym except Jack LaLanne.
Yeah.
But no one went to the gym to work out to become stronger. No one stretched before they played. They just walked out and started playing.
And Jack brought the gym home through the television set to millions of Americans.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
You probably knew your father better than anybody, or as well as anybody. What are some words you would use to describe him?
You know, I think that if I were to write a book about him, I would title it The World's Angriest Man.
Oh, wow.
He was by far the angriest person I've probably ever met in my life.
How did that affect you growing up thinking that, or in the same
Well,
household?
as a kid, my upbringing was a little bit different. We lived in South Central Los Angeles. It was actually lived south of that, but what today is known as South Central. But my weekends were spent at the golf course, and there were no other African American people, just my dad and myself. And so you made friends with other kids that you met there. And for my social life, I had friends in the neighborhood, but I also had friends in Beverly Hills, and I could spend weekends with them.
That
so
time period, you just didn't hear about that or see that.
my upbringing was a little bit different. In fact, because of my mom and dad, I learned what then was called the King's English. But my friends would always say that I didn't sound like them. So you literally had to learn two different forms of English in order to survive, because back then, things people didn't like or didn't understand would usually get you into a fist fight.
We call it code switching. No. So,
No, it's, you kind of navigate these two worlds, and that can be, challenging.
Well, I found it easy because
Yeah.
I'd never, quite frankly, been aware of any bias or racial prejudice until I was in the military.
Yeah.
So I missed all of that. Even if it was there, I never saw it because I didn't know what it was.
Do you think your dad's anger stems from that? What he saw, what he experienced growing up in the South?
His anger stemmed from the frustration of not being able to make a living the way he thought he should be able to make a living. And if you go back to the days where he was in his prime, there was no PGA Tour. There was only the PGA. The Tour had not broken away from the PGA at that point. And so you were a teacher on the one hand, but you were a competitor on the other hand. Fortunately for my dad and other players like Ted Rhodes, Joe Lewis, Alton Duhan, people like that, there was the National Golf Association, which at that time was considered to be the black tour or the African American tour. And they had it in different cities, like they had one in Phoenix, they had it in Cleveland, they had a tournament in Chicago, they had a tournament in St. Louis. But interestingly enough, if you know what the Green Book is, that's what they used to get around to all of these tournaments, and they had to drive.
And this is a tour that your father dominated, winning over 100 events, rumor has it. And what are your recollections of your father as a competitor?
My father used to have a saying about golf tournaments. They all wanted to finish what was called in the money. And so not only did you have to make the Friday cut, but you also had to score well enough so that they gave you a check. But with the UGA, the winner might only win $100. That was first place. So you traveled, and of course, like today, what you need to be a successful golfer is a sponsor. So my dad and Ted Rhodes, who I think were probably the top two African American players in the country between 1947 and 1955, always had Joe Lewis as their sponsor. Joe Lewis was making a great deal of money in those days. I mean, it's nothing today compared to then, but the value of the dollar was much greater. But they would band together and drive to these tournaments all over the country. There was a regular circuit like there was the PGA Tour, like the PGA Tour has today, but there were no airplanes. So they would drive to these tournaments, and again, that's where the Green Book came in, because you couldn't get from LA to Cleveland overnight. So you'd have a place to stop in between, and that was also before the interstate. So since most of these tournaments were in the Midwest, there were very few, if any, in the South, and then the rest of them were in the West. From Chicago west, they would drive the car with the clubs in the back and the water bag hanging on the front because there was no air conditioning.
Sure, yeah. And the great boxer Joe Lewis, the benefactor, financing them through their tour.
Joe financed, excuse me, my dad and Ted Rhodes. Ted Rhodes was his personal pro.
Yeah, and for the audience that might not be familiar with the Green Book, it is essentially a travel handbook used by African Americans so they could safely navigate and know where restaurants were where they could eat, motels where they could stay, places where their business would be welcome. In many cases, in most cases, African American businesses, in some cases white businesses, but where people could travel safely, this book guided them through the small towns and the highways of America. So it's a nice piece of history and way to bring that in. So in that period, in 1948, we're going to get to this important year, the Los Angeles Open is allowing African American players to play. And in that tournament that your father plays in at Riviera Country Club, he is tied with Ben Hogan after one round. Ben Hogan goes on to win. Your father finishes well enough to get a spot, kind of an exemption, into the subsequent tournament, which would be the Richmond Open up towards Oakland. Your father goes to Richmond, and when he arrives, the PGA of America lets him know, sorry, you're not playing. We have a Caucasians only clause, and this is in LA, we're going to enforce it. You're not playing. At this point, your father decides, that's enough, we're going to fight this. Can you fill us in from there? What What was that like in his world, going toe-to-toe with the PGA of America?
I can tell you what he tells me, because in 1948 I was just barely around. But I will tell you that he, along with a number of other golfers, filed a class action lawsuit. Stanley Mosk, who was known as a wonderful lawyer, and after whom our largest courthouse is named in downtown LA, was his lawyer as Attorney General for the state of California. And California had its own constitution and felt very strongly about the First Amendment, if you will, and what that meant. And so Stanley Mosk sued the PGA, and the PGA agreed to a settlement where they would allow players to play in their sanctioned tournaments, but once the settlement was reached, all they did was change the title of the tournament from Open to Invitational. Golf was always a sport that was played by the elite, if you will. And so if you had enough money, more so than any other endeavor, golf costs a lot more from the individual point of view. You had to buy your own equipment. You had to buy the right equipment. You had to pay green fees. You even had to buy special shoes, which back then said waterproof but weren't, but you still had to wear golf shoes with the metal cleats. So that's why sponsors were so important. You didn't need a sponsor for basketball or baseball or football. You didn't need one for volleyball, even though it wasn't that big at the time. But you did need one for golf, and by definition, what you needed to be was a rich person in order to afford to play the game. Even today, once you make the initial equipment investment, you've still got the problem of, can you play the same golf ball for one round? It's an ongoing cost. But the second most important thing I think to think about is that where were the golf courses located? There were none in the inner city. There were none close enough to reach in a logistical sense. So you actually had to drive to a different part of town or a different part of the state just to play, and places where segregation was still alive and well. So I think that all of that had a lot to do with the Caucasians only clause, but I think there was also a fear that if the game were open to ethnic minorities, then the ethnic minorities would take over the game because they had the greater athletic ability. And as you know, one, that didn't happen, but two, you can be the greatest athlete on the planet and still be the worst person ever to play golf.
Sure.
Indeed.
Yeah, the two don't necessarily go together.
That's correct.
Yeah.
They don't.
I think very seldomly do they do. You know what I'm saying? There's a bunch of people I know athletically just can't hit a golf ball.
I tell people, it's hard how we define that. Like you can meet someone who's an Olympian, and then you watch them throw the opening pitch at a baseball game, and it's you feel sorry for them that they had to do that in front of people on television.
I think with the PGA though, there was also an issue of control. If you can control the genre, then you can control what occurs within it. And in this case, they had names, Sam Snead, Ben Hogan, people like that were around at the time, and they just didn't want to admit any people of color into the club. So during that time, and again, I'll pick, the clause went into effect, I think 1916, and was eliminated in 1961. Not that it mattered, because quite frankly it didn't. But the people that were in charge had a fear that was based on perception rather than reality, but they were the ones in charge, and as we know, those that are in charge get to write history. So it was the same thing in the golf world. The fear was unrealistic, based on supposition, if you will. It was not based on reality, because if nothing else, there were less than 10 golfers that would have qualified to play in the tournaments anyway that were black during those days.
What got you into law? Was this, or witnessing this, was that part of it?
No, I hated golf.
No, we'll get into law.
What got me into the law?
Yeah.
The true story is that I was an academician in terms of my grades. I always took the toughest classes, always academics, and I'd tell people I don't know what a B looks like, which is pretty much true.
That's a big flex. I don't even know what a B looks like. I've never seen it. He goes, he skips it when he says the alphabet, A, C, D. I don't even know what a B looks like. I love it.
But I had a major event that occurred, and I started college in 1964, and then in 1966 the draft was prevalent in this country for Vietnam. I didn't go to summer school and was drafted by the Army and wound up in Vietnam and in the military for 2 years. When I came out, I had a sort of like an addiction to finishing the 2 years that I lost in 1 year. But when I finished my year for my undergraduate degree, didn't know what I wanted to do. So I applied to every graduate school there was, and USC sent me an acceptance letter for law school, and so that's where I wound up, because I was afraid I wasn't going to get accepted by anyone else.
So just serendipitous, kind of like.
And still never wanted to be a lawyer. Today I don't want to be one. On the other hand, you know, it affords me a decent living.
For sure.
I have found a niche within the practice to do something that I think makes a difference in people's lives and keeps me happy.
I think it's interesting what you said earlier about your father coming from a generation that didn't necessarily talk about the past. And I can absolutely relate to that in that my father wouldn't really talk about the Cuban Revolution much when I was growing up. And he's gone now, and I regret not having those conversations. But I do think that there's also an historical importance with the PGA being in Tulsa this week, with your father being from Tulsa, and I can't help but mention that, you know, we're coming off the heels of an incident in Buffalo that's, you know, there's a racially driven massacre in a grocery store. And it's almost 100 years after the massacre in Tulsa. And I hope that we can start to have deeper conversations generationally to hopefully avoid some of these things. And it's very interesting to me that your father, you've described him as very angry, someone that can hold a chip on his shoulder. And I wonder what it would have felt for him to have been posthumously, you know, in the Oklahoma Golf Hall of Fame, posthumously awarded membership with the PGA of America. How do you think he would have received those honors?
He would have said, it's about time, knowing him. His anger was a direct result of his frustration. You know, his background history was one of suppression and racism and prejudice and bias and being told no. And he always fought against that more frequently than not to his benefit. So he was slapped down a lot, to put it in the vernacular. But having said that, you know, he was very proud because as he grew older, things started to change. They didn't change for him, but they were starting to change societally. And he was always proud of, oh, there's Sidney Poitier. I get to see another African American on film. And then when you saw Diane Carroll on television, oh, look, there's a black person on TV. He would have been very proud of it, although he would have been seriously, continually angry at the PGA because in 1961, he was born in 1913. So he would have been at the end of his career when the Caucasians only clause was done away with, and still there were no changes made probably for the next 20 or 30 years. It was just lip service and nothing more. I mean, you can, if I'm not mistaken, there are more than 25,000 PGA pros today. Less than 30 of them are African American. That's less than 1/10%.
It's a really low number, and you know, part of talking about PGA Week, and you know, that splinter that happens, I think in 68 or 69, when the PGA Tour becomes its own thing, and the PGA of America remains its own entity for like club professionals. They've not, it's an amazingly low number. It's really staggering how low that is. And what are your thoughts as to how can that number grow?
That number's not going to grow. And I say that with decisiveness because there aren't enough opportunities that are brought into the neighborhoods where you find people that might have the interest in learning how to play the game. Golf is a game that on a good day is frustrating.
Yeah.
And that's on a good day, it's frustrating. And I think the people that play the game play it for one reason, and that is if they get one birdie in a round, or if they hit one good shot, that's what brings them back the next time they play. And working at it, you get better, but you never get good. You only get better. The professionals that play it for a living on the PGA Tour, even they had to go to Q school. Sure. Even they had to qualify. And you can tell just from who wins one tournament to the next tournament to the next tournament. If you have a bad 3 days at Q school, you're not going to get a card.
Yeah.
And you could be better than everyone else that's there. So a lot of it is driven by your ability to hit any type of a given shot on a given golf course.
So obviously we know your father as a pioneer, a golfer. He also caddied. He also was a teacher. He also ran a donut shop. One other thing that a lot of people don't know is he was a poet. And I happen to have with me a poem he wrote. It's called Easy to Love. And it reads, "My love for you, you may behold, is complete in its memory still untold. For one so beautiful and fair to see makes you easy to love by one like me. Your eyes, your hair, your tantalizing face keeps me wanting to hold you in my embrace. Your beautiful smile and personality makes you easy to love by one like me. Then be it that you are so fair with lovely skin and flowing hair, and eyes so clear and bright to see, makes you easy to love by one like me. So keep me, darling, in your heart. May I linger in your memory, there forever, never to part, to think you are loved by one like me." So he's this incredible mix of, he's like a poet warrior. And I find that so fascinating and rich and beautiful. As we close out here, Mr. Spiller, is there another fun fact you can tell us about your dad that people may not know about?
My dad wrote a lot of poems. It's sort of a fact and a half. He wrote a lot of poems after he arrived in Los Angeles from Oklahoma, and when he was working as a red cap. He had a lot of time on his hands at those times because unless there was a train about to depart or that just arrived, there was really no work for them to do. And he transitioned more into golf and less into manual labor because of the sky caps that came into being with the advent of air travel. So he did not work at the airport. But in his teaching as a golf professional, he was the personal pro for Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. So he used to teach them how to play golf. In the 50s and 60s, practically every big-name entertainer in Los Angeles, and they were all here except the Broadway
Sure.
actors, wanted to learn to play golf. And so he became a name in the entertainer circuit. So he taught Ella Fitzgerald, Duke Ellington, people like that.
What a life.
Truly an incredible life. Once again, we have to thank you. We're so grateful that you took time for your day. We are all grateful to everyone at the California African American Museum who have some of your father's artifacts that they were kind enough to bring out. And thank you so much, Mr. Spiller, for making time for us.
You're welcome, anytime.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure.
Truly.
Well, John, we learned quite a bit today.
Yeah, I told you I'm salivating, man, all this new knowledge.
I mean, we touched on so many different parts of golf and
History.
and history, and like bringing Los Angeles to life, bringing this great migration that was featured here at the museum, but also just we got a good chunk of America today, as kind of told through a few different lenses.
Seeing how much has changed and how much it hasn't.
And exactly that, and we also know that one guy who would rather do the hitting instead of being hit on the football field was Bill Spiller Jr. That's maybe my favorite fact.
That was an easy call.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
I respect it.
Well, thanks everybody for being a part of this and tuning in and supporting the Fire Pit Collective and Grassroots, and we're grateful for all of you. So thanks a lot.
That was fun.
Yeah, that was so great.